Welcome to the Defence Connect podcast, Australia's leading voice in national security and defence industry intelligence, direct from the nation's top policy and business experts.
Welcome to the Defence Connect podcast. You've got senior journalist Robert Dougherty, and we've got a guest for this podcast today. This is a research fellow in radicalisation, extremism, terrorism at ANU. It's Dr Levi West. Dr West is a former Director of Terrorism Studies at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security. He's currently working on an Office of National Intelligence funded grant regarding radicalism. Welcome to the podcast, Dr West.
Sure.
Today we're talking about the recent terror attack that was targeting the country's Jewish community at a Hanukkah event on Sydney's Bondi Beach. It's a Jewish festival of lights. 15 people were killed, including a 10-year-old girl. 2 rabbis and Holocaust survivor were also killed, including reportedly an Israeli and a French citizen. 2 police officers were shot and injured during the incident. Our thoughts are with the families of those killed and those injured in the tragedy, but it's likely this incident will be discussed and forensically examined well into the future. The 2 gunmen have been identified by police as father and son Sajid Akram, 50, and his son Naveed Akram, 24. Older man was shot by police and has died. The young man is in critical condition in hospital. 2 Islamic State flags were found in their car reportedly, and his son was allegedly investigated by ASIO in 2019 for ISIS links, while the father attained a firearms permit in 2015. Dr West, what's your initial thoughts on the gravity of what you saw yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, look, and firstly, let me echo my sympathies and everything else for everyone who's been affected by this, and that in particular to the first responders and to the law enforcement officers who were shot and injured, and to all the victims and their families. This is obviously an absolutely horrific event by Australian standards and by any metric. I guess it's important to kind of contextualize it in a way that's a little bit more historically orientated, which is that over the sort of peak period of Islamic, and now that we can sort of speak about this as seemingly an Islamic State affiliated or inspired operation, this is comfortably the worst terrorist attack in Australian history. But it's important for us to recognise that during the peak period of Islamic State's caliphate, so-called caliphate, Australia had more Islamic State terrorist attacks than any other Five Eyes country. We've had a significant pause since that peak period of Islamic State affiliated or Islamic State inspired terrorist attacks, but it's not as if we were immune to them previously. So once we one of the most important things about analysing or trying to understand terrorism is to try and get beyond and outside the initial shock and horror and outrage and the terror that comes with it. That's a obviously difficult thing to do when we're, less than 48 hours out from an incident. However, once we do that, we can start to put it into some context and have a look at, well, is this as much of an aberration as it feels like in the moment as it happens, or is this something that sits within a degree of continuity with things that have already happened in Australia? And the truth of the matter is it is. It sits in line with the stabbing incident at Endeavour Hills in Melbourne, where 2, a Vic Pol officer and an Australian Federal Police officer were stabbed, and a whole series of Islamic State-inspired incidents that took place in Australia. So whilst it is obviously incredibly confronting and incredibly horrific, it's important for us to sort of recognise that actually there's a history here and a lineage of Islamic State operations in Australia that's useful to sort of, contextualise the operation.
There's a continuation almost.
Yeah. With a big pause, don't get me wrong. But we had a very quiet period after the caliphate was significantly degraded in Iraq and Syria, and the centre of gravity for Islamic State kind of migrated to Northern Africa. The orientation their focus has not been on trying to inspire actors in the West. The last major one, I think, in the West was the New Orleans attack around New Year's.
What did you think of the response from the public so far, and what might this mean for the Australian public into the future, some of those impacts that might be more long-term?
I think one of the things that Australia does incredibly well, and it's usually around this time of year when natural disasters of some type roll in, bushfires, whatever it might be, is that in the breach of crises, we tend to see acts that sort of really demonstrate the best of, and I'm not even going to say best of Australia, the best of humanity, right? And Ahmed is, I think, I hope, winds up being the kind of defining story that comes out of this.
Yes.
Rather than it being a story of tragedy and loss, there are, that guy, without thinking twice, took on an armed man and almost certainly saved countless lives. And I sort of hope that in the aftermath of the kind of analysis of what may or may not have gone wrong in trying to prevent it, what may or may not have been done well in terms of the immediate tactical response and so on and so forth, that's the thing that gets remembered is him.
Yes.
Particularly because he's a migrant and a Muslim, which does a really good job of undercutting a bunch of the really offensive politics that tend to fall out of these things. Like irrespective of where anyone stands, there tends to be a whole bunch of really horrible politics that falls out of these kinds of incidents. So in the first instance, I hope that's kind of what we take away from this. Not that and I'm certainly confident that the government wouldn't actively encourage people to intervene the next time they find themselves in those sort of circumstances. But, from a narrative perspective, I hope that that's the story.
Yeah.
The rest, sorry, go ahead.
Just on that as well, I think, reviewing that footage, we can kind of see, the mentality that he followed the government's advice. Obviously he did intervene, but when he did, he was able to disarm one of the people. But then to put that weapon down and say, I'm not going to take this further. I'm not going to, shoot the person.
Very smart. Which
would have definitely intervened some police regulations there, I imagine.
Yeah. There was putting that firearm down very quickly was a very, very smart move. There was every possibility that he was going to be shot and killed. If he was him standing next to the bloke who he just took the firearm off of in the breach, expecting people to delineate, I don't know if he was the actual gun. No, the people involved are trained to he has a firearm. And in an Australian context, having a firearm full stop is so unusual that, it's an entirely reasonable assumption to make that whoever has the firearm is a threat.
So a different story in America, perhaps.
Yes, where perhaps some kind of level of delineation between whether they're a good guy or a bad guy or whatever kind of simplistic binary we want to put there. But, in terms of the sort of the formal response, I think, again, picking up on that kind of best of humanity thing, is all of the police officers who showed up off duty in uniform at Bondi Police Station, reportedly. What do you want me to do? Right? No one was making sure they filled out paperwork. No one was making sure they're getting paid overtime, right? Everyone just shows up. What do you need us to do? Okay, cool. I'll go out and walk towards the crisis. And I think that those two things reflect the fact that whilst obviously the incident itself and its anti-Semitic components are horrific, it's I think it's always important with terrorism to remind ourselves that it is in fact a rare event. They very rarely take place, certainly in countries like us. Outside of war zones, terrorism is a really rare event. And as much as it feels like, and it should, that, I think a number of times in the last 48 hours I've talked about the analogy between shark attacks and terrorist attacks, right? That when someone gets taken by a shark, everyone feels like it's more dangerous to go in the ocean. Statistically, it's not. It just feels like it is because there's just been an incident and that's the way our brains work. Terrorist attacks are exactly the same, right? So to me, with a little bit of space, it's possible to start to think about the fact that actually in this horrible event, there's some really, really quite amazing stories. I saw one in the news yesterday of a couple who'd been separated from their young child. And when they eventually found said young child, there was an elderly woman lying over the top of her, protecting her, who'd been shot. Now, survived, but who'd been shot. And so, like in any tragedy, right, we can choose to focus on those stories, or we can choose to focus over here. And I think the sensible thing that we should do now as a sort of collective community is to be trying to find positive stories out of these things rather than and leave it to nerds like me and people in government to pore over and do analytical work on it. That's valuable and necessary and everything else. But I think for most people, that's where the focus ought to be.
Yeah. On the nerd side of it, as you say,
Yes.
what are the national security implications from this, or even the public, psychology point of view for the long term? Do you think there's going to be significant change out of this, or it basically weather over time?
Yeah, look, I hope that what it does, and I'll be judicious here with my language. The defence and national security apparatus of Australia was focused on terrorism almost exclusively for an extended period of time. The defence apparatus too, right? Everyone who went to Afghan, Iraq, and so on and so forth. The sandpit sort of dominated an entire generation's worth of post 9/11 defence and national security agendas. That's changed, right? For quite good reason. Terrorism was probably too high a priority for a large chunk of that period. There's plenty of arguments being made that in the adjustments to state-based threats, or however we want to frame that up, the pivot away from counterterrorism, or the deprioritization of counterterrorism, has been too harsh and too blunt, and that as a result, it's harder to do as a government, as a department, as an agency, as a law enforcement agency, whatever it might be. That the defence and national security pie is fixed, and there's only so much money that's in that pie, and when an enormous chunk of that is being spent on X, Y, and Z in explicit long-term acquisition projects, that's money that was being spent on something else. And this is not to say that there's a willful exercise in trying to not do CT well. It's just a reality of what happens when you move money around in budgets and you change priorities. So I hope that's not something that I normally like to consider as an analytical strategy, that perhaps this will address some of that, what is now in some ways an imbalance, right? That, and especially if you start to think of the way that terrorism can be used as a tool of statecraft as much as it can. These guys, and this is not to suggest, in the immediate aftermath of the incident, a lot of the conversations that I was having was that there was essentially three viable buckets of bad guys that this came from. One was the Salafi jihadi attack. The other was a neo-Nazi attack, but that seemed like a big escalation for NSN, a really, really big one for those guys. Or, given that we booted the ambassador from Iran, it was a significant escalation by those guys. But the reality is it could have been that too, right? My point is that if we think about terrorism as a tool that sits within the grey zone tactical bag of hostile nation states, then maintaining CT capability becomes not just a thing that we need to do because of Salafi jihadis, which we do, but a thing that we have to do because there's also a bunch of hostile nation states out there who like to use third party, whether we call them proxies or whether it's a bunch of once removed cutout processes like IRGC did with the synagogue in Melbourne and the deli in Sydney. CT is not just about chasing jihadis around the sandpit anymore. It's a much more complex environment and a much more challenging environment, and one that can be used to sow discord as much as it can to try and, kill the non-believers or whatever these two blokes, thought they were doing. So, I'd hope that that's part of what comes out of this. And the other one, and I say this with a degree of recognition that I think neither side of politics has necessarily covered themselves in glory in terms of how to respond to the growing anti-Semitism issues that have existed in Australia since October 7. I don't think the government's gotten it 100% right, but I think the opposition at times has played really kind of childish politics with it, right? I can remember over the last summer when there was a multitude of apparent anti-Semitic incidents taking place, some of which, as it turned out, were being done by guys who can barely spell Israel, let alone be anti-Semitic. They're getting paid, right? That's the IRGC guys. That was being referred to as a domestic terrorism crisis by members of the opposition, and that's nonsense, right? It was bad and it needed attention, and I'm not saying that the government was getting it 100% right at all, but it also wasn't a domestic terrorist crisis, and that's a really juvenile way to frame up a very, very serious issue. And so I would hope that in the aftermath of this, something resembling a reset on how the country, not the government, not the opposition, but how the country deals with the anti-Semitism problem that it has. And don't get me wrong, I think the Prime Minister yesterday or today, or the Home Affairs Minister, made the genuine point that, anti-Semitism in Australia didn't start when Labor won office in 2019 or whatever it was. And he's right. Anti-Semitism is thousands of years old. But I would hope that off the back of this, perhaps a slightly more sensible and moderate conversation about how we ought to try and get at this problem and tackle this problem ought to come out of it. Whether it does or not, we can say, but I would hope that that's part of the problem.
I think the hope is that this is a serious incident, and so they'll have a serious think about what their policies are going to be. Just on that as well, we've seen that the federal government and New South Wales state government has pledged to tighten firearms legislation in the wake of the shooting. Is this the right way to go down that path of the reset and, towards, I guess, action against future terrorism incidents?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have a view that guns should be exceptionally difficult to get your hands on. Like, if you're not in the military, you're not in law enforcement in this country, the harder you can make it for people to get their hands on fire, I'm entirely okay with that, right? Because if you really want to, either you're a farmer or you're a serious shooter, in which case you should be willing to basically be entirely transparent about your existence, because you get to have things that can kill people really effectively. Like, I'm pretty fine with really, really tough gun laws. That being said, I don't think that addresses the big upstream questions of why did a guy who's been here since the late 90s and had seemingly a reasonably successful existence, kids and a house and all of these things, right? His life hasn't fallen completely down the drain. Go from having guns because he was a member of a gun club. You can remove the guns from the equation. There's still two dudes who want to kill a bucket load of Jews at a Hanukkah festival, right? And so unless we're sort of dealing with that, and I'm sort of cognizant of feathering my own bow on radicalisation research, but unless we're getting our heads around like how and why these two individuals wanted to do this thing, then removing the firearms means that we have a vehicle ramming incident at Bondi.
Yeah.
Like, unless you ask the second order questions of like, okay, they did this thing here with guns and that was the means, but why did they wind up wanting to do this in the first place? That to me is the much more complicated question.
One thing I did notice as well from some of the footage was that they were carrying knives as well. And from what we've seen in the UK, that can still be a problem even without the firearms. So we'll have to wait and see on some of the government recommendations there regarding it.
Like I said, generally supportive, right? Like I don't think in this country that it's problematic to make it exceptionally difficult to get your hands on firearms, regardless of who you are. Don't care, right? It should be very difficult. That's fine. It's a positive thing to do, but it misses all of the other parts that have them wanting to do something.
It's not the golden bullet. Then we I guess.
I understand the politics of it, but
just on that note, we'll go to a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about some of the different media reports that are out. Welcome back to the Defence Connect podcast. You've got senior journalist Robert Dougherty, and we've got a guest from ANU, Research Fellow Radicalisation, Extremism and Terrorism, Dr Levi West. And we're just talking about some of the media reports now from that Bondi shooting, from the tragedy there. Some of the indications that we're getting is that both of these men who are the shooters travelled to the Philippines for a month, possibly, prior to the shooting for an unknown reason. Dr. West, is this an indication that there's some sort of link between radicalisation there or training there that could have happened?
Yeah, so I saw those reports in the last this morning, I guess. And I did some digging and I've had a few conversations, and the first issue with those stories is that it's talking about the Philippines as a terrorist hotbed. And that's nonsense. The south of the Philippines, the southern island of Mindanao, yes, but the northern half is not that at all, right? It's very, very, very shallow reporting to call the Philippines a hotbed of terrorism. That's nonsense. The south is.
Major strategic partner as well for defence as well, I'll note. Yeah.
Far be it from me. Yeah, and like essentially like a vassal of the United States in a lot of ways too. There's a few parts to it, right? So there is training and camps and all that stuff in the southern Philippines. There is Islamic State versions of that. But you can't just like show up and be like, hey, can you teach me how to run around and shoulder a firearm and use a semi-automatic rifle in a way that to your average Australian viewer, it looks like he's really professionally trained.
Yeah.
He's not. He's just like competent, right? It is possible that they went to the Philippines, these two Australians, got to Manila, which is where they would have flown into, then made their way down south, didn't get killed, managed to make their way to an Islamic State training camp that assumedly they just looked up on Google, right? Because the thing is, for them to have been able to do what's being implied in that coverage, they would have needed connectivity to people and relationships with people in those camps that ought to have set off red flags.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like to have the connections that you would need, because it's not like Ghana, Syria at the peak of the caliphate where you had hundreds of people just flying across an open border. There's a much more difficult enterprise. So, look, it is possible. Equally, of the places that you can go and get like ex-military guys to give you some rudimentary run around, yell at you, throw on some fatigues and shoot some firearms. The Philippines is pretty good for that in an entirely legitimate and kosher way. In Manila, right, you can go and do that. So it's equally plausible that they went over and did get some training, but just not in a camp in the south. It's also plausible that they went to the Philippines for very different reasons, that they didn't have any engagement with anything to do with the military. That could have been shaped more by the fact that they decided they were going to do an operation and they were going to die.
Yeah. Have one last night out on the town sort of thing.
So to speak. Yeah, I don't think everyone knows what that's about. So all of these are sort of equally plausible. Probably the least plausible is that in the absence of them having a whole bunch of connectivity that would be disproportionate, especially since like we haven't seen a claim of if they pledged allegiance, which reporting suggests that they did. Then sometime in the next 24 hours to 48 hours tops, we should see a claim, a recognition of that Pledge of Allegiance from something Islamic State orientated. Don't get me wrong, their machine is not what it was at its peak, and they're not punching out press releases like they used to. But yeah, I think at this point, in the absence of some detail, it reminds me, of when in the aftermath of Christchurch, when Brenton Tarrant's travel history was exposed. And it's like, oh, well, he went here and he went. I'm like, yeah, but he went to North Korea too, mate. Like, so, if I'd want to, if I was making an assessment, I'd want to see all of their travel prior, right, in the last 5 years. And if it was to the Philippines and, then that decreases. It makes it seem less unusual. If all it was going to the Philippines, then yes, we ask some questions. It also, we have a pretty good, in fact, I'd say very good working relationship with the Filipino authorities on CT specifically. And two Australians showing up in Manila and then meandering their way to Mindanao and going to a training camp seems like the kind of thing that
throwing a red flag, maybe.
Someone would have twigged. So look, I could be completely wrong. They might have gone and spent a month in a training camp in the southern Philippines. That is possible. But of the people that I've spoken to this morning, I'd be surprised.
No, unlikely. What about that other red flag we were talking about before, that the son was previously on a watch list in, I believe, 2000 and, we saying 2019?
Yeah.
Yep. His father at the time obviously had a shooting license for that 10-year period, the public is going to ask a lot of questions about how those two match up. Is there a decision to say, if you're on an ASIO watch list and you're in the same house as someone who has firearms, maybe the government should be stepping in there?
Yeah, so there's a few parts to that. The first one is he wasn't on a watch list. He was investigated because he was peripheral to people who were under substantive investigation.
Yeah.
And by my understanding, the assessment was essentially that, like, oh, yeah, okay, he's got a relationship with this guy who we're interested in, but he doesn't seem like he's an issue. Right? And I think I said to someone yesterday, that assessment at the time could have been 1,000% correct.
Yeah, it was a small fish. Yeah.
Yeah, like that kind. And when you've got fixed resources, those kind of assessments get made all the time, right? They happen in conventional criminal investigations of like, yeah, I don't think he's the main player here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to dedicate time, money, effort, manpower, etc. That's my understanding of the 2019 assessment. And because that assessment was that he wasn't someone who needed to have attention paid to him, even if there were mechanisms to tie that intel assessment, because it's not a law enforcement one, right? It's an intelligence assessment, back to gun licenses, then all of you would have been doing is that there's a guy here who was investigated because he was peripheral and determined to be of no further interest, but he wasn't even a POI, right? Yeah. Then even if you plug that into gun licensing, etc., it's just not grounds to take away someone's gun license is that your kid has a mate who's a dead right? Like that's not enough. Don't get me wrong, again, to sort of circle that back around to some of the reforms that are being talked about towards gun legislation, they're talking quite explicitly about trying to link intelligence assessments to maintaining your gun licenses.
I'd be surprised if those systems talk to each other. At a federal level and a state level, I'd be really surprised if that talked to each other.
Indeed. There's also then the challenge that's going to wind up in administrative appeals tribunals forever, which is that the basis on which you want to take away my gun license, which I've obtained legally because I met the criteria, because that guy did, right? He met the criteria. The incredibly stringent ones that we have in Australia. He was an active member of a club, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But taking away my legally obtained gun license on the basis of an intelligence assessment that no one in my appeal case is allowed to see is going to struggle from a due process and natural justice perspective. Don't get me wrong, if it's taking the hands out of bad guys, I'm less concerned about the legal side of things. But
it doesn't look good to have that blank page saying we don't know the reason, I guess. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things about CT in a country like Australia, and I think it holds in most Western countries, is that if the only time that law was being applied was to guys like these two idiots, that'd be great. But the way law works is that it applies to everybody. And so when we assess whether or not we want things to be enshrined in the legislation, we ought to think about, well, yeah, but hang on a minute. What if a piece of law like that winds up being applied to me?
Yeah.
And then I assess the law very differently. So,
just on another point that we have seen in the media reports, we saw from footage that when obviously both were arrested, one post being alive, we saw a civilian approach one of the men while he was cuffed and reportedly stomped on his head. I mean, we saw that pretty clearly. And at that point, the civilian yells, "Effing Nazi." What does this tell you about the current extremism climate in Australia, that I guess the civilian public, their first thought was, hey, these guys are the guys that protested on the bridge or in the streets earlier?
Yeah, I hadn't seen the grab, like the quote. Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting over the last bundle of years. I've done a fair amount of work, training, delivery, and stuff like that for government. I'm a consultant too. Is people's differing understanding of what the word Nazi means. Right? It doesn't always mean black clad National Socialist networks. It can be a reference to kind of fascist attitudes as well. But if we assume that what they were doing was responding to something where they had just assumed that given the target, it would make logical sense to assume that these guys are a bunch of neo-Nazis. I think what it tells us is that the National Socialist network whose primary objective is more about profile and media stunts and their political party project than it is about committing like terrorist violence.
Mhm.
The way the extreme right tends to function is that you'll have an organization like National Socialist Network. They will not be the ones who do terrorism. They will produce propaganda and push the ideology and the ideas and do a very good job of that, but keep themselves very relatively clean-skinned. It's the people who sit on the periphery of that who go off and do stuff because those guys aren't hardcore enough.
Mhm.
And that's what we saw with Brenton Tarrant, right? Tom Sewell, the current leader of the National Socialist Network, tried to recruit Brenton Tarrant into a previous iteration of his organisation, and Tarrant said no, because he was going to go off and do a thing. So they've been very good at inserting themselves into our public discourse in ways that present a dilemma for the media, right? You can't not report on that protest outside Parliament House, but in doing so, you've got to tell the name of the organisation. And even if you're being very responsible at that, you're still promoting them, right? Like it's unavoidable. So I think people have a much more natural sense of associating anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence with neo-Nazis, like as a direct and simple connectivity piece. I don't think jihadis by the lay public, despite the lengthy history and anti-Semitism being a fairly integral component of their worldview, I don't think they associate jihadi terrorism with anti-Semitism the same way that they do neo-Nazis.
Mm.
And so to me, it's a reasonable response. You know, when I spoke to, on Sunday night, when I spoke to like my parents and a whole bunch of lay people who rang me saying like, what in God's name is going on?
Yeah.
They all assumed it was too.
Yeah.
But
it's been quite public. I mean, we've had demonstrations over the past, year. Basically, there's been a lot of public events since October 7, attacks in Israel.
Yep.
And a lot of marches and things. Has that had an effect where, we're seeing more radicalization and I guess a lead up to something like this, or is it just separate?
So I think there's a really important and really, I'll try and be as nuanced as I can with this. I have, as someone with Jewish heritage, deep disagreements with the Netanyahu government and the Israeli policies in Gaza. Before October 7, especially since October 7, if anyone wants to call me an anti-Semite, I'm happy to fight them about that, right? It's just nonsensical. This conflation that advocating for Palestinian not deaths, if we can set a really low bar for that, is somehow equivalent to anti-Semitism is a bunch of disingenuous nonsense, right? There's been a whole bunch of protests, which is entirely unsurprising given what's happening in Gaza, right? There ought to be protests about what's happening in Gaza because it's horrific and horrible and outrageous. So was October 7, but this is on an industrial scale. It's a separate and distinct thing. And it's a nation state who deserves to be held to account for what they're doing in terms of their military operations. There are small factions and components within that pro-Palestinian movement who hold something that we can maybe start to call extremist ideas. And there's a handful of slogans that I think in most instances are being deployed by people who don't understand what they really mean, right?
Yep.
So an undergrad, enthusiastic, first time they've been politicized, not radicalized, is because Gaza is happening. And when they say globalize the intifada, I'm not sure they're across the key role that Hamas suicide operations played in the first intifada. I'm not sure there's that depth of that knowing that what you're actually saying. I'm giving them any shit, to be fair.
Maybe it's similar. Perhaps it's similar to the Socialist Alliance we were talking about previously, where you have one group who does the propaganda and the marches and stuff, and then you have a separate group that is more hardcore. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's also historically, if I refer to that pro-Palestinian movement as the part of the kind of a broad left of Western politics, sort of, historically, very, very disorganized. Yeah. So the idea that when they did the big march across the Harbour Bridge, that there was like a centralized edict other than the organizational piece that said that these are the 3 slogans for today. Make sure that you wear this, this, or this, right? You'll note that it's a really diverse, it's a bunch of sort of leftist, socialist-ish protesters, a bunch of sort of Muslim community protesters, quite rightly mobilized by the fact that they're part of the world and they're people being killed. It's a much more diverse enterprise than, say, the National Socialist Network, which by nature is exclusionary, right? You have to a very strict criteria to be one of us. Those pro-Palestinian protests, there's handfuls of people within that are being radicalized, if we want to sort of call it that. The hard part about anything to do with radicalization, and I'll make 2 points here, is that the vast majority of people that radicalize never do anything at all. Right? They just don't. There's like a firecracker that doesn't quite go off properly and peters out, and they just go away. The other thing that's important to recognize, and this is not in any way to diminish the centrality of anti-Semitism to what happened on Sunday, but like Islamic State declared its caliphate in 2014.
Yeah.
And it would appear that these guys are Islamic State-inspired operatives. That much seems reasonably solid in the public reporting. And if that's the case, then I can probably make a case for the idea that the targeting decisions were informed in a post-October 7 and post-Israeli response to October 7 environment. But the ideological commitment is much broader than that. It is a commitment to Islamic State ideology.
Yeah.
Where anti-Semitism is a component of that, but Islamic State operatives in the West and jihadi operatives in the West generally as well, so Al-Qaeda-inspired ones too, have hit numerous Jewish targets over the years. There's Jewish delis and Jewish grocery stores in Europe, and a whole litany of Jewish targets for jihadis. But they've also hit a whole bunch of other stuff too, right? It's not the exclusive provenance of jihadi operatives to target only Jewish targets, because they've got a much broader spread than just that as their list of who qualifies for being killed. So I think it's important for us to as it becomes kind of increasingly clear that these guys were Islamic State inspired, to remember that, yes, October 7 and the atmosphere around anti-Semitism and all of these things is an important part of understanding what happened. But so is that, where I started with that kind of historical contextualization, that yes, but there's also some stuff that is drawing on things that existed before October 7. So I think it's important that we keep that sort of the bigger picture of Islamic State at the forefront of how we understand what happened.
How does that radicalization occur? Is that, obviously there is a difference between the Iran-led, operations that we saw earlier this year that were announced by ASIO. Is this more the case? It seems like it's more of a familial, radicalization that may have taken over time to develop since, I think you said 2014, since the caliphate was announced. Well, what are your thoughts there?
So I think you mentioned the Iranian one, and I think it's a really important piece to sort of delineate from most of the conversation we're having about sort of conventional CT, is that the people who did the attack on the synagogue in Melbourne and the deli in Sydney, and I think there was language to suggest that there was a few of the other incidents as well that they may have been responsible for, or at least IRGC facilitation was. The perpetrators, as best I can tell, weren't radicalized. They did it for money.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're criminals for hire for the most part.
Cash jobs.
Yeah. Didn't really know who they were doing it for, didn't really understand if it had a purpose or anything other than just you need to do an ask at this address. So that's not radicalized at all. Right? Okay. They can be shitbags. That's okay. But it's not really radicalization in the sense that they didn't have you need a cause, right? You need an ideology. Radicalization more broadly, and I'll save you from a super nerdy explanation of the work that we're doing at ANU.
We've got time for that, I don't.
There's a paper I can happily send through a link to the paper, and you can punch it out with the podcast. Is a complex interplay of almost infinite numbers of factors. But at its core, what we're talking about, and this is from said paper, it's just belief adoption, right? We just happen to think that a particular set of beliefs are extreme. That's a subjective measure. We can't objectively measure how extreme someone's beliefs are. But the process by which you adopt Islamic State jihadi ideas, neo-Nazi ideas, or convert to, I don't know, Hinduism this afternoon, it's the same. Right? We're all wired up mostly the same. We all go through roughly the same processes. In short, it's kind of a combination and a self-referential feedback loop between your cognitive disposition, so the bits of your wiring that are the way that they are, a bunch of identity stuff that's about the environments that you put yourself in. Right, so in my view, probably the strongest one is that once you sort of dip your toe into a chat room or a Discord server or a Telegram channel, that's you adopting, you will progressively begin to adopt the behaviours that you think go along with that identity. In the same way that when you go to the footy, right, you behave like a maniac for a couple of hours. If you were to behave like that on the train home on a Wednesday afternoon, you would, someone would call the authorities, right? So this combination between your cognitive disposition, a bunch of identity determining and seeking stuff, and then your behavior that comes off the back of that, and all three of them reinforce each other is the basic way of describing it. These two guys, there's not enough information to really get much of a handle. And the other challenge is that, radicalisation is not an offence. It's the thing that you do that probably won't lead to you doing something like what happened on Sunday. So when Naveed, the younger brother who's in a coma, I think I heard this morning, when he was assessed in 2019, he may well have believed in Islamic State ideology, but that's not an offence. And in and of itself, if you've got guys who believe but are also facilitating plane tickets for people to go to Syria and Iraq, or facilitating, obtaining firearms or precursor chemicals or whatever, then the guy who just believes is of less importance than the guys who do believe but are doing things. So in the absence of more information on his trajectory, what we do know is that often there will be something resembling what we would call a catalyst, right? There'll be a moment. Brenton Tarrant talked about it in his manifesto. He was overseas. He saw news coverage of a young girl in Sweden, from memory, Elka, someone I think, being killed in a jihadist terrorist attack. And that was his, right, I'm going to do something moment. Right? So if the radicalisation process is the kind of the slow burn process that gives you all of the background noise that you need, then there is often something that can drive the decision to actually dad, in this case, weird. Not unheard of, usually siblings though, rather than multi-generational, for you to go right, we're going to go off and do a thing.
I think in this case, perhaps it is because of that familial link that is it possible ASIO didn't pick it up because that feedback loop and that point was maybe happening in-house. It wasn't happening online, obviously. Is that? I mean, it's speculation, but is that possible?
Yeah, it is possible, but I would assume, or rather deduce, let me put it that way, sounds a little bit better.
More professional, for sure.
That's right, indeed. I would deduce, based on sort of most of the data that I've seen, across the board, that the younger one would be the driver of the agenda, right? That Islamic State was targeting primarily kids closer to his age than dad's age. I would certainly be starting where my investigation of their radicalisation pathway with the 24-year-old, not the 50-year-old. That's an assumption, but generally speaking, I would assume, given that whilst there's some connectivity to some institutions in Western Sydney, Southwest Sydney, none of the usual suspects have been mentioned in terms of institutions. So I would hazard a guess that much of what he was accessing would have been all online. Now, don't get me wrong, that is harder to detect than it was when Islamic State, circa 14, 15, 16, was doing all their propaganda stuff on Twitter. That was a reasonably easy thing. I was tracking that. When it's all on closed Telegram channels, it makes it a harder thing to surveil. Not impossible by any measure, but much harder and more complex. You need personas and all kinds of stuff. It's a more complex exercise. But I don't think we've got much of a picture, frankly, at this stage, rather than me deducing stuff.
Speculating.
Yeah, pretty much, which I've been trying desperately to avoid doing for the last sort of 36 hours. So, but from what we know outside of this case, from what we know about terrorism generally, and particularly Islamic State terrorism, I would assume that 24-year-old fella was accessing it online and that he's driven his dad, however that's played out. Yeah.
We'll go to a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking about what happens next. Welcome back to the Defence Connect podcast. You've got senior journalist Rob Dougherty here and a research fellow from ANU, Dr Levi West. And we're talking about what happens next after the Bondi shooting. Are we likely to see radicalised reprisals from the event? Are we likely to see, I guess, imitation violence, as some people might call it? What happens now into the future?
Yeah. Look, I'd be surprised if we saw any sort of reciprocal stuff. If we were going to, I think it would have happened on Sunday night.
Same day. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like Monday morning or whatever. And don't get me wrong, I'm old enough, God, to have been, an undergraduate student when Cronulla happened. And there was parts of me sort of getting very uncomfortable with where it might go. Seemingly, that's not the case. Look, there is a body of literature around a thing formerly called reciprocal radicalisation. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of it. I think neo-Nazis don't need a jihadi attack on the Jewish community, which I don't think they'd really be all that fussed by, to provide them with the basis to go and do something. They've got all the reasons they need. And the same goes for everyone, right? Vigilante violence, I can sort of see. And I assume that was a significant part of the messaging that, you heard the PM and the Home Affairs Minister quite quickly. And in fact, it was the New South Wales Police Commissioner on Sunday night, straight to camera, hard, like, do not. Right? Which is why there's a significant New South Wales police presence on the streets, is to try and make sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen. That conversation reminds me a bit of in the aftermath of the Lint Cafe, where a whole bunch of concerns about that kind of thing were around, but then a sort of organic hashtag campaign was launched and a whole bunch of people were getting on the train to head home to Western Sydney and making sure that the young girl in a hijab was okay.
Yeah.
And just sort of circle back to that point at the start, I think in crises like this, because this is a step change in terms of Australia's exposure to terrorism. This is a really, really, really graphic, and, location matters a lot for this too, right? In terms of the resonance that it's having, is we tend to find the best bits of the Australian community come out. And some of that can just be the bloke who goes like, no, mate, don't do that. That's stupid. Yeah. So on that front, I don't think there's too much risk now that there's been we've all taken a breath out the other side. What I hope it does is that, and there's some reporting in the Australian on this morning, is that pivot to strategic competition, to use the formal language of the department, finds a way to more coherently and sensibly incorporate counterterrorism as I've had this conversation many times over the years, right? I'm a fan of the idea of I don't think it's a great measure because it depends what you spend it on, but a fixed percentage of GDP for defence spending is a neat kind of permanent thing that allows us to be like, this is a thing we always have to spend money on. I don't have a figure. I don't think percentage of GDP is necessarily what it should be, but counterterrorism doesn't go away. I understand why at the end of, Afghanistan and Iraq and everything else and the wars on terror and everything else that went with it, we wanted to not have to do that anymore. as a community, as a public, as a government. It's the fatigue is real. I understand that. Except we don't really have a choice, right? Like, as this sort of demonstrates. And so finding a way to better balance up sort of CT and the rest of the defense and national security, the rest of the national security apparatus, because defense doesn't really have the same role that it had previously, since we're not doing expeditionary stuff. Is that if we're going to do anything, I hope that's what it is. And in very frank terms, that means money.
Yep.
Right? It needs money. There is inadequate resourcing. There needs to be more money that gets pushed into, and I'll be transparent here, into research and education and training, right? They are the way. I did it for the best part of 15 years, right? Mostly it's at my old shop at CSU, where we were constantly training delivering professional development and running a master's program. And the vast majority of the people going through that program were all soldiers and police officers and intellos, etc. And, it doesn't need the largesse of the early days of the war on terror. But it needs
a baseline.
It does, right? Like the idea that we wouldn't view it as a kind of permanent part, unfortunately, but a permanent part of the security apparatus that necessarily requires two things. The first one is like funding and resourcing. The other one is continuity, right? These are complex things to investigate. They're complex things to understand. And if you're rotating everyone through on a 2-yearly basis, what you lose is ongoing relationships, ongoing knowledge acquisition, etc., etc. Like that is a APS issue, not a exclusively CT issue. But yeah, what I would hope is that we can that the government recognises that this is something that is running on fumes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a good way to wrap up the podcast for today. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's a pleasure, mate. No problem at all.